In this video, we're going to talk about making decisions in our program using something called an if statement. In the programs we've been able to create up to this point, our program follows a linear step. It always does one instruction after the next. And so we might write a program, for example, to calculate the user's cell phone bill based on the number of minutes that they've spent that month. And we could do that if the user always paid a certain amount per minute. So let's say the user pays 10 cents per minute. Our program might look something like this. And this is the flow chart for the program. So what the program does, it gets the user's name, then it gets how many minutes they use this month. It calculates their bill, that would be 10 cents times the number of minutes they used, and then it displays that total, that calculation. We take the flow chart and we can turn it into code, and I'm leaving out a few lines here to get the scanner set up and things like that, but we're getting the name, that's keyboard.nextLine, the number of minutes with nextInt. We're calculating the cost, the number of minutes times 10 cents or $0.1, and then we're printing out the cost when we're done. That works great for a very simple program, for a very simple cell phone plan. But a lot of people may have a certain number of free minutes in their plan and a monthly cost, and that's where we have to start making a decision. So let's really focus on the part where we're calculating that user's bill. We've got the number of minutes, but we want to figure out, let's say the user pays $50 every month no matter what. So they pay $50 even if they never touch their cell phone. And for that they get 400 free minutes. Now this gets a little bit more complicated. We have a decision to make. We calculate their total one way if they've used fewer than 400 minutes, and we calculate their total a different way if they've used more than 400 minutes. So let's talk about this part where we calculate their bill. They always pay $50. But then we have a question, we have a decision here. Did they spend more than 400 minutes on the phone? If the answer is yes, we'll do one thing. We'll say, well, they get charged an extra 10 cents per minute for every minute over the 400. So if they talked for 401 minutes, they just get charged 10 cents. They don't get charged 10 cents for every minute. If the answer was no, then we just keep going. They pay the $50, there's no extra fee. So we have this decision here. At more than 400 minutes, the answer is yes, they did spend more than 400 minutes, and so we do an extra calculation. Or the answer is no, and we skip that calculation entirely. And then we'll take this new, more complicated part of our flowchart and put it back in our original plan. So we get the user's name, get their cell phone minutes, they'll always pay $50, but then we ask a question. Did they talk more than 400 minutes? If yes, then we'll add 10 cents per minute over the 400 to that cost. Either way, then we display the user's bill. So how do we code this up? How do we write this in Java? Let's just focus on this more complicated part where we're doing the calculation and then displaying the output. So we'll assume we already know the number of minutes they have. The beginning and the end are very straightforward. We've seen these before. So the cost is set to 50, and then at the end we display the cost. The way we write a decision is by using an if statement. So we write the word if, and then in parentheses we write our what's called a condition. In this case, we want to do some extra work if minutes is greater than 400. So we write something here that is true if we want to do some extra work. And the next video we'll talk a lot more about conditions and what things we can put in those parentheses. But right now we're saying if minutes is greater than 400, we want to do some extra work. We use an open curly brace that's right next to the P key on your keyboard. You'll have to do Shift and that key, the square brace, is the one if you don't hit Shift that you'll get. That open curly brace means this is the chunk of code that I want to do if this minutes is greater than 400 is true. If that's true, we can break this into a couple steps. Let's figure out how many extra minutes did they use. So we know they talked more than 400 minutes or we wouldn't be running this code at all. How many extra minutes did they talk? So if they talked 401 minutes, this would be 1. If they talked 500 minutes, this would end up as 100. And then we'll say the cost is equal to what it used to be, 50, plus 10 cents times however many extra minutes they spent. And lastly, we have to put this close brace back in there so that we say that was the extra section of code. Now I want to continue running. Let's see what happens when we run this. Let's first try with an input of 500. So we start cost is equal to 50, and then the program asks, is minutes greater than 400? 500 is greater than 400, so we're going to go inside this if statement. Extra minutes is minutes minus 400. There were 100 extra minutes. Our cost gets added to that. The cost of those extra 100 minutes would be $10. Our new cost is the old cost, 50, plus the new cost, the cost of the extra minutes, which is 10. So our new cost is going to be $60. When we continue with the program, it'll display a cost of $60. Now let's see what happens if the user types in 300. Cost is equal to 50, but 300 is not greater than 400. That's not true, so it doesn't run the code inside those curly braces. It just jumps down and continues running past it, and it'll display a cost of $50. So let's write this up in Eclipse and make sure it's doing what we want to do. I've got the beginning parts here where we get the name and the number of minutes. I've got the end where we display the cost, but now we need to do the calculation. So we start by saying the cost is $50, and that'll be the base cost if they have extra minutes, or that'll be the whole cost if that's all they spend. Then we've got an if statement. If minutes is greater than 400, then I want to do something extra. So I'll put my open curly brace. I'm going to press enter. Eclipse is really friendly and actually puts in a closing brace for me. It'll do that most of the time, but you'll have to make sure that that's there. And then I want to say, well, if they spent more than 400 minutes, then the extra minutes is however minutes they spent minus 400. And the new cost is equal to whatever cost used to be plus 0.1, 10 cents times the number of extra minutes. Then I go down here and I print out the cost. So let's make sure this works. If the user doesn't spend 400 minutes on the phone, then we'd expect cost to just be $50. So 300 minutes gives us a cost of $50. Let's try again with more minutes though. Let's do 500 minutes. We previously figured out that should be an extra $10. And so now there's a total of $60. So this is working perfectly. You'll notice here that I indent. Eclipse tries to help me do this automatically, but what we do is we keep the code lined up, but as soon as we're inside an if statement, we scooch it over one more spot. And that makes it really easy for us to just quickly look and tell what is part of the if statement. The closing brace is really what Java uses, the closing brace and the opening brace. But for our eyes, that's a lot harder to read. We want to make sure that we scoot the code over so it's very clear this code is inside of the if statement and this code is after the if statement. One last thing to know, and that's that if we try to display the number of extra minutes at the bottom here, I'll just print it out directly. We're going to get an error message, and it's going to tell us that it can't be resolved to a variable, essentially that variable doesn't exist. What's going on is that we created the variable, but we created it inside our code for the if statement. That means it only exists inside that code. Essentially, any variable we create only lives within the braces that it was created in. And the reason for that is pretty simple. If minutes was not more than 400, let's say minutes was 300, we would go through this code, we'd hit our if statement, and we'd skip everything inside of it. And then we would never have created that variable extra minutes. We'd never have used it, anything like that. Any variable that gets created will only exist between the braces around it. What we can do if we really want to print out the number of extra minutes, we need to make two changes. We need to actually create it up above. So now we created the variable. We can use it inside our if statement, but then it still exists to print it out afterwards. So we created the variable outside of these braces, which means that even afterwards it still exists. We have a new problem though. It says it may not have been initialized. It's possible for us to run this code, create the variable, but if minutes is not more than 400, we never give it a value. And so up at the top, we'll have to give it some kind of a value. Let's just set it to 0. That way, if there are 300 minutes, we don't do this if statement, it still has a value, there's still something we can print out. So we'll often create variables inside of if statements, and they'll only exist inside that if statement, but if you want to be able to use it afterwards, You've got to create the variable beforehand and then assign it some kind of a value no matter what.